The two gentlemen dressed in elegant hunting costume stopped at the sight of the little group camping in gypsy fashion. They looked as if they wondered what could bring an armed party there, but when they saw the ladies get out of the wagon, they dismounted instantly and went toward them hat in hand. Lord Glenarvan came to meet them, and, as a stranger, announced his name and rank. The gentlemen bowed, and the elder of them said, "My lord, will not these ladies and yourself and friends honor us by resting a little beneath our roof?" "Mr." began Glenarvan. "Michael and Sandy Patterson are our names, proprietors of Hotham Station. Our house is scarcely a quarter of a mile distant." "Gentlemen," replied Glenarvan, "I should not like to abuse such kindly offered hospitality." "My lord," returned Michael Patterson, "by accepting it you will confer a favor on poor exiles, who will be only too happy to do the honors of the wilds." Glenarvan bowed in token of acquiescence. "Sir," said Paganel, addressing Michael Patterson, "if it is not an impudent question, may I ask whether it was you that sung an air from the divine Mozart last night?" "It was, sir," replied the stranger, "and my cousin Sandy accompanied me." "Well, sir," replied Paganel, holding out his hand to the young man, "receive the sincere compliments of a Frenchman, who is a passionate admirer of this music." Michael grasped his hand cordially, and then pointing out the road to take, set off, accompanied by the ladies and Lord Glenarvan and his friends, for the station. The horses and the camp were left to the care of Ayrton and the sailors. Hotham Station was truly a magnificent establishment, kept as scrupulously in order as an English park. Immense meadows, enclosed in gray fences, stretched away out of sight. In these, thousands of bullocks and millions of sheep were grazing, tended by numerous shepherds and still more numerous dogs. The crack of the stockwhip mingled continually with the barking of the collies and the bellowing and bleating of the cattle and sheep. Toward the east there was a boundary of myalls and gum trees, beyond which rose Mount Hotham, its imposing peak towering 7,500 feet high. Long avenues of green trees were visible on all sides. Here and there was a thick clump of grass trees, tall bushes 10 feet high like the dwarf palm, quite lost in their crown of long, narrow leaves. The air was balmy and odorous with the perfume of scented laurels, whose white blossoms, now in full bloom, distilled on the breeze the finest aromatic perfume. To these charming groups of native trees were added transplantations from European climates. The peach, pear, and apple trees were there, the fig, the orange, and even the oak, to the rapturous delight of the travelers, who greeted them with loud hurrahs. But astonished as the travelers were to find themselves walking beneath the shadow of the trees of their own native land, they were still more so at the sight of the birds that flew about in the branches. The satin bird, with its silky plumage, and the king honeysuckers, with their plumage of gold and black velvet. For the first time, too, they saw here the lyre bird, the tail of which resembles in form the graceful instrument of Orpheus. It flew about among the tree ferns, and when its tail struck the branches, they were almost surprised not to hear the harmonious strains that inspired Amphion to rebuild the walls of Thebes. Paganel had a great desire to play on it. However, Lord Glenarvan was not satisfied with admiring the fairy-like wonders of this oasis, improvised in the Australian desert. He was listening to the history of the young gentleman. In England, in the midst of civilized countries, the newcomer acquaints his host whence he comes and whither he is going. But here, by a refinement of delicacy, Michael and Sandy Patterson thought it a duty to make themselves known to the strangers who were about to receive their hospitality. Michael and Sandy Patterson were the sons of London bankers. When they were 20 years of age, the head of their family said, "Here are some thousands, young men. Go to a distant colony and start some useful settlement there. Learn to know life by labor. If you succeed, so much the better. If you fail, it won't matter much. We shall not regret the money which makes you men." The two young men obeyed. They chose the colony of Victoria in Australia as the field for sowing the paternal banknotes and had no reason to repent the selection. At the end of 3 years, the establishment was flourishing. In Victoria, New South Wales, and southern Australia, there are more than 3,000 stations, some belonging to squatters who rear cattle, and others to settlers who farm the ground. Till the arrival of the two Pattersons, the largest establishment of this sort was that of Mr. Jamieson, which covered an area of 75 miles, with a frontage of about 8 miles along the Perron, one of the affluents of the Darling. Now Hotham Station bore the palm for business and extent. The young men were both squatters and settlers. They managed their immense property with rare ability and uncommon energy. The station was far removed from the chief towns in the midst of the unfrequented districts of the Murray. It occupied a long, wide space of 5 leagues in extent, lying between the Buffalo Ranges and Mount Hotham. At the two angles north of this vast quadrilateral, Mount Aberdeen rose on the left, and the peaks of High Barvin on the right. Winding, beautiful streams were not wanting, thanks to the creeks and affluents of the Ovens River, which throws itself at the north into the bed of the Murray. Consequently, they were equally successful in cattle breeding and farming. 10,000 acres of ground, admirably cultivated, produced harvests of native productions and exotics, and several millions of animals fattened in the fertile pastures. The products of Hotham Station fetched the very highest price in the markets of Castlemaine and Melbourne. Michael and Sandy Patterson had just concluded these details of their busy life, when their dwelling came in sight at the extremity of the Avenue of the Oaks. It was a charming house, built of wood and brick, hidden in groves of amaryllis. Nothing at all, however, belonging to a station was visible, neither sheds, nor stables, nor cart houses. All these outbuildings, a perfect village comprising more than 20 huts and houses, were about a quarter of a mile off in the heart of a little valley. Electric communication was established between this village and the master's house, which, far removed from all noise, seemed buried in a forest of exotic trees. At Sandy Patterson's bidding, a sumptuous breakfast was served in less than a quarter of an hour. The wines and viands were of the finest quality, but what pleased the guests most of all in the midst of these refinements of opulence was the joy of the young squatters in offering them this splendid hospitality. It was not long before they were told the history of the expedition, and had their liveliest interest awakened for its success. They spoke hopefully to the young Grants, and Michael said, "Harry Grant has evidently fallen into the hands of natives, since he has not turned up at any of the settlements on the coast. He knows his position exactly, as the document proves, and the reason he did not reach some English colony is that he must have been taken prisoner by the savages the moment he landed." "That is precisely what befell his quartermaster, Ayrton," said John Mangles. "But you, gentlemen, then, have never heard the catastrophe of the Britannia mentioned?" inquired Lady Helena. "Never, madam," replied Michael. "And what treatment, in your opinion, has Captain Grant met with among the natives?" "The Australians are not cruel, madam," replied the young squatter, "and Miss Grant may be easy on that score. There have been many instances of the gentleness of their nature, and some Europeans have lived a long time among them without having the least cause to complain of their brutality." King, among others the sole survivor of the Burke expedition, put in Paganel. "And not only that bold explorer," returned Sandy, "but also an English soldier named Buckley, who deserted at Port Phillip in 1803, and who was welcomed by the natives and lived 33 years among them. And more recently," added Michael, "one of the last numbers of the Australasia informs us that a certain Morelli has just been restored to his countrymen after 16 years of slavery. His story is exactly similar to the captain's, for it was at the very time of his shipwreck in the Peruvian, in 1846, that he was made prisoner by the natives and dragged away into the interior of the continent. I therefore think you have reason to hope still." The young squatter's words caused great joy to his auditors. They completely corroborated the opinions of Paganel and Ayrton. The conversation turned on the convicts after the ladies had left the table. The squatters had heard of the catastrophe at Camden Bridge, but felt no uneasiness about the escaped gang. It was not a station, with more than 100 men on it, that they would dare to attack. Besides, they would never go into the deserts of the Murray, where they could find no booty, nor near the colonies of New South Wales, where the roads were too well watched. Ayrton had said this too. Glenarvan could not refuse the request of his amiable hosts to spend the whole day at the station. It was 12 hours delay, but also 12 hours rest, and both horses and bullocks would be the better for the comfortable quarters they would find there. This was accordingly agreed upon, and the young squatters sketched out a program of the day's amusements, which was adopted eagerly. At noon, 7 vigorous hunters were before the door. An elegant break was intended for the ladies, in which the coachman could exhibit his skill in driving four in hand. The cavalcade set off preceded by huntsmen, and armed with first-rate rifles, followed by a pack of pointers barking joyously as they bounded through the bushes. For 4 hours the hunting party wandered through the paths and avenues of the park, which was as large as a small German state. The Ruislades or Saxe-Coburg Gotha would have gone inside it comfortably. Few people were to be met in it certainly, but sheep in abundance. As for game, there was a complete preserve awaiting the hunters. The noisy reports of guns were soon heard on all sides. Little Robert did wonders in company with Major McNabbs. The daring boy, in spite of his sister's injunctions, was always in front and the first to fire. But John Mangles promised to watch over him, and Mary felt less uneasy. During this battue, they killed certain animals peculiar to the country, the very names of which were unknown to Paganel, among others the wombat and the bandicoot. The wombat is an herbivorous animal, which burrows in the ground like a badger. It is as large as a sheep, and the flesh is excellent. The bandicoot is a species of marsupial animal which could outwit the European fox and give him lessons in pillaging poultry yards. It was a repulsive-looking animal, a foot and a half long, but, as Paganel chanced to kill it, of course he thought it charming. An adorable creature, he called it. But the most interesting event of the day, by far, was the kangaroo hunt. About 4 o'clock, the dogs roused a troop of these curious marsupials. The little ones retreated precipitately into the maternal pouch, and all the troop decamped in file. Nothing could be more astonishing than the enormous bounds of the kangaroo. The hind legs of the animal are twice as long as the front ones, and unbend like a spring. At the head of the flying troop was a male 5 feet high, a magnificent specimen of the Macropus giganteus, an old man, as the bushmen say. For 4 or 5 miles the chase was vigorously pursued. The kangaroos showed no signs of weariness, and the dogs, who had reason enough to fear their strong paws and sharp nails, did not care to approach them. But at last, worn out with the race, the troop stopped, and the old man leaned against the trunk of a tree, ready to defend himself. One of the pointers, carried away by excitement, went up to him. Next minute the unfortunate beast leaped into the air and fell down again completely ripped up. The whole pack, indeed, would have had little chance with these powerful marsupia. They had to dispatch the fellow with rifles. Nothing but balls could bring down the gigantic animal. Just at this moment, Robert was well nigh the victim of his own imprudence. To make sure of his aim, he had approached too near the kangaroo, and the animal leaped upon him immediately. Robert gave a loud cry and fell. Mary Grant saw it all from the break, and in an agony of terror, speechless and almost unable even to see, stretched out her arms toward her little brother. No one dared to fire for fear of wounding the child. But John Mangles opened his hunting knife, and at the risk of being ripped up himself, sprang at the animal and plunged it into his heart. The beast dropped forward, and Robert rose unhurt. Next minute he was in his sister's arms. "Thank you, Mr. John, thank you," she said, holding out her hand to the young captain. "I had pledged myself for his safety," was all John said, taking her trembling fingers into his own. This occurrence ended the sport. The band of marsupia had disappeared after the death of their leader. The hunting party returned home, bringing their game with them. It was then 6 o'clock. A magnificent dinner was ready. Among other things, there was one dish that was a great success. It was kangaroo tail soup, prepared in the native manner. Next morning very early, they took leave of the young squatters, with hearty thanks and a positive promise from them of a visit to Malcolm Castle when they should return to Europe. Then the wagon began to move away, round the foot of Mount Hotem, and soon the hospitable dwelling disappeared from the sight of the travelers like some brief vision which had come and gone. For 5 miles further, the horses were still treading the station lands. It was not till 9 o'clock that they had passed the last fence and entered the almost unknown districts of the province of Victoria. Chapter 15: Suspicious Occurrences. An immense barrier lay across the route to the southeast. It was the Australian Alps, a vast fortification, the fantastic curtain of which extend 500 miles and pierce the clouds at the height of 4,000 feet. The cloudy sky only allowed the heat to reach the ground through a close veil of mist. The temperature was just bearable, but the road was toilsome from its uneven character. The extumescences on the plain became more and more marked. Several mounds planted with green young gum trees appeared here and there. Further on, these protuberances, rising sharply, formed the first steps of the Great Alps. From this time their course was a continual ascent, as was soon evident in the strain it made on the bullocks to drag along the cumbrous wagon. Their yoke creaked, they breathed heavily, and the muscles of their hose were stretched as if they would burst. The planks of the vehicle groaned at the unexpected jolts, which Ayrton with all his skill could not prevent. The ladies bore their share of discomfort bravely. John Mangles and his 2 sailors acted as scouts, and went about 100 steps in advance. They found out practical paths, or passes, indeed they might be called, for these projections of the ground were like so many rocks, between which the wagon had to steer carefully. It required absolute navigation to find a safe way over the billowy region. It was a difficult and often perilous task. Many a time Wilson's hatchet was obliged to open a passage through thick tangles of shrubs. The damp, argillaceous soil gave way under their feet. The route was indefinitely prolonged owing to the insurmountable obstacles. Huge blocks of granite, deep ravines, suspected lagoons, which obliged them to make 1,000 detours. When night came, they found they had only gone over half a degree. They camped at the foot of the Alps, on the banks of the Creek of Cabangra, on the edge of a little plain, covered with little shrubs 4 feet high, with bright red leaves which gladdened the eye. "We shall have hard work to get over," said Glenarvan, looking at the chain of mountains, the outlines of which were fast fading away in the deepening darkness. The very name Alps gives plenty of room for reflection. "It is not quite so big as it sounds, my dear Glenarvan. Don't suppose you have a whole Switzerland to traverse. In Australia there are the Grampians, the Pyrenees, the Alps, the Blue Mountains, as in Europe and America, but in miniature. This simply implies either that the imagination of geographers is not infinite, or that their vocabulary of proper names is very poor." "Then these Australian Alps," said Lord Glenarvan, "are—" "Mere pocket mountains," put in Paganel. "We shall get over them without knowing it." "Speak for yourself," said the Major. "It would certainly take a very absent man who could cross over a chain of mountains and not know it." "Absent, but I am not an absent man now. I appeal to the ladies. Since ever I set foot on the Australian continent, have I been once at fault? Can you reproach me with a single blunder?" "Not one, Monsieur Paganel," said Mary Grant. "You are now the most perfect of men." "Too perfect," added Lady Helena, laughing. "Your blunders suited you admirably." "Didn't they, madam? If I have no faults now, I shall soon get like everybody else. I hope then I shall make some outrageous mistake before long, which will give you a good laugh. You see, unless I make mistakes, it seems to me I fail in my vocation." Next day, the 9th of January, notwithstanding the assurances of the confident geographer, it was not without great difficulty that the little troop made its way through the Alpine pass. They were obliged to go at a venture, and enter the depths of narrow gorges without any certainty of an outlet. Ayrton would doubtless have found himself very much embarrassed if a little inn, a miserable public house, had not suddenly presented itself. "My goodness," cried Paganel, "the landlord of this inn won't make his fortune in a place like this. What is the use of it here?" "To give us the information we want about the route," replied Glenarvan. "Let us go in." Glenarvan, followed by Ayrton, entered the inn forthwith. The landlord of the Bush Inn, as it was called, was a coarse man with an ill-tempered face, who must have considered himself his principal customer for the gin, brandy, and whiskey he had to sell. He seldom saw anyone but the squatters and rovers. He answered all the questions put to him in a surly tone, but his replies sufficed to make the route clear to Ayrton, and that was all that was wanted. Glenarvan rewarded him with a handful of silver for his trouble, and was about to leave the tavern, when a placard against the wall arrested his attention. It was a police notice, and announcing the escape of the convicts from Perth, and offering a reward for the capture of Ben Joyce of £100 sterling. "He's a fellow that's worth hanging, and no mistake," said Glenarvan to the quartermaster. "And worth capturing still more, but what a sum to offer, he is not worth it." "I don't feel very sure of the innkeeper, though, in spite of the notice," said Glenarvan. "No more do I," replied Ayrton. They went back to the wagon, toward the point where the route to Lucknow stopped. A narrow path wound away from this which led across the chain in a slanting direction. They had commenced the ascent. It was hard work. More than once both the ladies and gentlemen had to get down and walk. They were obliged to help to push round the wheels of the heavy vehicle, and to support it frequently in dangerous declivities, to unharness the bullocks when the team could not go well round sharp turnings, prop up the wagon when it threatened to roll back, and more than once Ayrton had to reinforce his bullocks by harnessing the horses, although they were tired out already with dragging themselves along. Whether it was this prolonged fatigue, or from some other cause altogether, was not known, but one of the horses sank suddenly, without the slightest symptom of illness. It was Mulready's horse that fell, and on attempting to pull it up, the animal was found to be dead. Ayrton examined it immediately, but was quite at a loss to account for the disaster. "The beast must have broken some blood vessels," said Glenarvan. "Evidently," replied Ayrton. "Take my horse, Mulready," added Glenarvan. "I will join Lady Helena in the wagon." Mulready obeyed, and the little party continued their fatiguing ascent, leaving the carcass of the dead animal to the ravens. The Australian Alps are of no great thickness, and the base is not more than 8 miles wide. Consequently, if the pass chosen by Ayrton came out on the eastern side, they might hope to get over the high barrier within 48 hours more. The difficulty of the route would then be surmounted, and they would only have to get to the sea. During the 18th, the travelers reached the topmost point of the pass, about 2,000 feet high. They found themselves on an open plateau, with nothing to intercept the view. Toward the north, the quiet waters of Lake Omco, all alive with aquatic birds, and beyond this lay the vast plains of the Murray. To the south were the wide-spreading plains of Gippsland, with its abundant gold fields and tall forests. Their nature was still mistress of the products and water, and great trees where the woodman's axe was as yet unknown, and the squatters, then 5 in number, could not struggle against her. It seemed as if this chain of the Alps separated two different countries, one of which had retained its primitive wildness. The sun went down, and a few solitary rays piercing the rosy clouds, lighted up the Murray district, leaving Gippsland in deep shadow, as if night had suddenly fallen on the whole region. The contrast was presented very vividly to the spectators placed between these two countries so divided, and some emotion filled the minds of the travelers, as they contemplated the almost unknown district they were about to traverse right to the frontiers of Victoria. They camped on the plateau that night, and next day the descent commenced. It was tolerably rapid. A hailstorm of extreme violence assailed the travelers and obliged them to seek a shelter among the rocks. It was not hailstones, but regular lumps of ice, as large as one's hand, which fell from the stormy clouds. A waterspout could not have come down with more violence, and sundry big bruises warned Paganel and Robert to retreat. The wagon was riddled in several places, and few coverings would have held out against those sharp icicles, some of which had fastened themselves into the trunks of the trees. It was impossible to go on till this tremendous shower was over, unless the travelers wished to be stoned. It lasted about an hour, and then the march commenced anew over slanting rocks still slippery after the hail. Toward evening the wagon, very much shaken and disjointed in several parts, but still standing firm on its wooden discs, came down the last slopes of the Alps, among great isolated pines. The passage ended in the plains of Gippsland. The chain of the Alps was safely passed, and the usual arrangements were made for the nightly encampment. On the 21st, at daybreak, the journey was resumed with an ardor which never relaxed. Everyone was eager to reach the goal, that is to say the Pacific Ocean, at that part where the wreck of the Britannia had occurred. Nothing could be done in the lonely wilds of Gippsland, and Ayrton urged Lord Glenarvan to send orders at once for the Duncan to repair to the coast, in order to have at hand all means of research. He thought it would certainly be advisable to take advantage of the Lucknow route to Melbourne. If they waited, it would be difficult to find any way of direct communication with the capital. This advice seemed good, and Paganel recommended that they should act upon it. He also thought that the presence of the yacht would be very useful, and he added that if the Lucknow road was once passed, it would be impossible to communicate with Melbourne. Glenarvan was undecided what to do, and perhaps he would have yielded to Ayrton's arguments, if the Major had not combated this decision vigorously. He maintained that the presence of Ayrton was necessary to the expedition, that he would know the country about the coast, and that if any chance should put them on the track of Harry Grant, the quartermaster would be better able to follow it up than anyone else, and finally, that he alone could point out the exact spot where the shipwreck occurred. McNabbs voted therefore for the continuation of the voyage, without making the least change in their program. John Mangles was of the same opinion. The young captain said even that orders would reach the Duncan more easily from Twofold Bay than if a message was sent 200 miles over a wild country. His counsel prevailed. It was decided that they should wait till they came to Twofold Bay. The Major watched Ayrton narrowly and noticed his disappointed look, but he said nothing, keeping his observations, as usual, to himself. The plains which lay at the foot of the Australian Alps were level, but slightly inclined toward the east. Great clumps of mimosas and eucalyptus, and various odorous gum trees, broke the uniform monotony here and there. The Gastrolobium grandiflorum covered the ground, with its bushes covered with gay flowers. Several unimportant creeks, mere streams full of little rushes, and half covered up with orchids, often interrupted the route. They had to ford these. Flocks of bustards and emus fled at the approach of the travelers. Below the shrubs, kangaroos were leaping and springing like dancing jacks. But the hunters of the party were not thinking much of the sport, and the horses little needed any additional fatigue. Moreover, a sultry heat oppressed the plain. The atmosphere was completely saturated with electricity, and its influence was felt by men and beasts. They just dragged themselves along and cared for nothing else. The silence was only interrupted by the cries of Ayrton urging on his burdened team. From noon to 2 o'clock, they went through a curious forest of ferns, which would have excited the admiration of less weary travelers. These plants in full flower measured 30 feet in height. Horses and riders passed easily beneath their drooping leaves, and sometimes the spurs would clash against the woody stems. Beneath these immovable parasols, there was a refreshing coolness which everyone appreciated. Jacques Paganel, always demonstrative, gave such deep sighs of satisfaction that the paroquets and cockatoos flew out in alarm, making a deafening chorus of noisy chatter. The geographer was going on with his sighs and jubilations with the utmost coolness, when his companions suddenly saw him reel forward, and he and his horse fell down in a lump. Was it giddiness, or worse still, suffocation caused by the high temperature? They ran to him, exclaiming, "Paganel, Paganel, what is the matter?" "Just this, I have no horse now," he replied, disengaging his feet from the stirrups. "What, your horse?" Dead like Mulready's, as if a thunderbolt had struck him. Glenarvan, John Mangles, and Wilson examined the animal and found Paganel was right. His horse had been suddenly struck dead. "That is strange," said John. "Very strange, truly," muttered the major. Glenarvan was greatly disturbed by this fresh accident. He could not get a fresh horse in the desert, and if an epidemic was going to seize their steeds, they would be seriously embarrassed how to proceed. Before the close of the day, it seemed as if the word epidemic was really going to be justified. A third horse, Wilson's, fell dead, and what was, perhaps equally disastrous, one of the bullocks also. The means of traction and transport were now reduced to 3 bullocks and 4 horses. The situation became grave. The unmounted horsemen might walk, of course, as many squatters had done already. But if they abandoned the wagon, what would the ladies do? Could they go over the 120 miles which lay between them and Twofold Bay? John Mangles and Lord Glenarvan examined the surviving horses with great uneasiness, but there was not the slightest symptom of illness or feebleness in them. The animals were in perfect health and bravely bearing the fatigues of the voyage. This somewhat reassured Glenarvan, and made him hope the malady would strike no more victims. Ayrton agreed with him, but was unable to find the least solution of the mystery. They went on again, the wagon serving, from time to time, as a house of rest for the pedestrians. In the evening, after a march of only 10 miles, the signal to halt was given, and the tent pitched. The night passed without inconvenience beneath a vast mass of bushy ferns, under which enormous bats, properly called flying foxes, were flapping about. The next day's journey was good. There were no new calamities. The health of the expedition remained satisfactory. Horses and cattle did their task cheerily. Lady Helena's drawing room was very lively, thanks to the number of visitors. Albinett busied himself in passing round refreshments which were very acceptable in such hot weather. Half a barrel of Scotch ale was sent in bodily. Barclay & Co. was declared to be the greatest man in Great Britain, even above Wellington, who could never have manufactured such good beer. This was a Scotch estimate. Jacques Paganel drank largely and discoursed still more de omni recibili. A day so well commenced seemed as if it could not but end well. They had gone 15 good miles, and managed to get over a pretty hilly district where the soil was reddish. There was every reason to hope they might camp that same night on the banks of the Snowy River, an important river which throws itself into the Pacific, south of Victoria. Already the wheels of the wagon were making deep ruts on the wide plains, covered with blackish alluvium, as it passed on between tufts of luxuriant grass and fresh fields of gastrolobium. As evening came on, a white mist on the horizon marked the course of the Snowy River. Several additional miles were got over, and a forest of tall trees came in sight at a bend of the road, behind a gentle eminence. Ayrton turned his team a little toward the great trunks, lost in shadow, and he had got to the skirts of the wood, about half a mile from the river, when the wagon suddenly sank up to the middle of the wheels. "Stop," he called out to the horsemen following him. "What is wrong?" inquired Glenarvan. "We have stuck in the mud," replied Ayrton. He tried to stimulate the bullocks to a fresh effort by voice and goad, but the animals were buried halfway up their legs and could not stir. "Let us camp here," suggested John Mangles. "It would certainly be the best place," said Ayrton. "We shall see by daylight tomorrow how to get ourselves out." Glenarvan acted on their advice and came to a halt. Night came on rapidly after a brief twilight, but the heat did not withdraw with the light. Stifling vapors filled the air, and occasionally bright flashes of lightning, the reflections of a distant storm, lighted up the sky with a fiery glare. Arrangements were made for the night immediately. They did the best they could with the sunk wagon, and the tent was pitched beneath the shelter of the great trees, and if the rain did not come, they had not much to complain about. Ayrton succeeded, though with some difficulty, in extricating the three bullocks. These courageous beasts were engulfed up to their flanks. The quartermaster turned them out with the four horses, and allowed no one but himself to see after their pasturage. He always executed his task wisely, and this evening Glenarvan noticed he redoubled his care, for which he took occasion to thank him, the preservation of the team being of supreme importance. Meantime, the travelers were dispatching a hasty supper. Fatigue and heat destroy appetite, and sleep was needed more than food. Lady Helena and Miss Grant speedily bade the company good night and retired. Their companions soon stretched themselves under the tent or outside under the trees, which is no great hardship in this salubrious climate. Gradually, they all fell into a heavy sleep. The darkness deepened owing to a thick current of clouds which overspread the sky. There was not a breath of wind. The silence of night was only interrupted by the cries of the moorpork in the minor key, like the mournful cuckoos of Europe. Towards 11 o'clock, after a wretched, heavy, unrefreshing sleep, the Major woke. His half-closed eyes were struck with a faint light running among the great trees. It looked like a white sheet and glittered like a lake, and McNabbs thought at first it was the commencement of a fire. He started up and went toward the wood, but what was his surprise to perceive a purely natural phenomenon. Before him lay an immense bed of mushrooms, which emitted a phosphorescent light. The luminous spores of the cryptograms shone in the darkness with intensity. The Major, who had no selfishness about him, was going to waken Paganel, that he might see this phenomenon with his own eyes, when something occurred which arrested him. This phosphorescent light illumined the distance half a mile, and McNabbs fancied he saw a shadow pass across the edge of it. Were his eyes deceiving him? Was it some hallucination? McNabbs lay down on the ground, and, after a close scrutiny, he could distinctly see several men stooping down and lifting themselves up alternately, as if they were looking on the ground for recent marks. The Major resolved to find out what these fellows were about, and without the least hesitation or so much as arousing his companions, crept along, lying flat on the ground, like a savage on the prairies, completely hidden among the long grass. Chapter 16. A Startling Discovery. It was a frightful night. At 2 a.m., the rain began to fall in torrents from the stormy clouds and continued till daybreak. The tent became an insufficient shelter. Glenarvan and his companions took refuge in the wagon. They did not sleep, but talked of one thing and another. The Major alone, whose brief absence had not been noticed, contented himself with being a silent listener. There was reason to fear that if the storm lasted longer, the snowy river would overflow its banks, which would be a very unlucky thing for the wagon, stuck fast as it was already in the soft ground. Mulready, Ayrton, and Mangles went several times to ascertain the height of the water, and came back dripping from head to foot. At last day appeared, the rain ceased, but sunlight could not break through the thick clouds. Large patches of yellowish water, muddy, dirty ponds indeed they were, covered the ground. A hot steam rose from the soaking earth and saturated the atmosphere with unhealthy humidity. Glenarvan's first concern was the wagon. This was the main thing in his eyes. They examined the ponderous vehicle and found it sunk in the mud in a deep hollow in the stiff clay. The forepart had disappeared completely, and the hind part up to the axle. It would be a hard job to get the heavy conveyance out, and would need the united strength of men, bullocks, and horses. "At any rate, we must make haste," said John Mangles. "If the clay dries, it will make our task still more difficult." "Let us be quick, then," replied Ayrton. Glenarvan, his two sailors, John Mangles, and Ayrton went off at once into the wood, where the animals had passed the night. It was a gloomy-looking forest of tall gum trees, nothing but dead trees, with wide spaces between, which had been barked for ages, or rather skinned like the cork oak at harvest time. A miserable network of bare branches was seen above 200 feet high in the air. Not a bird built its nest in these aerial skeletons. Not a leaf trembled on the dry branches, which rattled together like bones. To what cataclysm is this phenomenon to be attributed, so frequent in Australia, entire forests struck dead by some epidemic? No one knows. Neither the oldest natives, nor their ancestors who have lain long buried in the groves of the dead, have ever seen them green. Glenarvan, as he went along, kept his eye fixed on the gray sky, on which the smallest branch of the gum trees was sharply defined. Ayrton was astonished not to discover the horses and bullocks where he had left them the preceding night. They could not have wandered far with the hobbles on their legs. They looked over the wood but saw no signs of them, and Ayrton returned to the banks of the river, where magnificent mimosas were growing. He gave a cry well known to his team, but there was no reply. The quartermaster seemed uneasy, and his companions looked at him with disappointed faces. An hour had passed in vain endeavors, and Glenarvan was about to go back to the wagon, when a neigh struck on his ear, and immediately after a bellow. "They are there," cried John Mangles, slipping between the tall branches of gastrolobium, which grew high enough to hide a whole flock. Glenarvan, Mulrady, and Ayrton darted after him, and speedily shared his stupefaction at the spectacle which met their gaze. 2 bullocks and 3 horses lay stretched on the ground, struck down like the rest. Their bodies were already cold, and a flock of half-starved-looking ravens croaking among the mimosas were watching the unexpected prey. Glenarvan and his party gazed at each other, and Wilson could not keep back the oath that rose to his lips. "What do you mean, Wilson?" said Glenarvan, with difficulty controlling himself. "Ayrton, bring away the bullock and the horse we have left. They will have to serve us now." "If the wagon were not sunk in the mud," said John Mangles, "these 2 animals, by making short journeys, would be able to take us to the coast. So we must get the vehicle out, cost what it may." "We will try, John," replied Glenarvan. "Let us go back now, or they will be uneasy at our long absence." Ayrton removed the hobbles from the bullock and Mulrady from the horse, and they began to return to the encampment, following the winding margin of the river. In half an hour they rejoined Paganel and McNabbs and the ladies, and told them of this fresh disaster. "Upon my honor, Ayrton," the Major could not help saying, "it is a pity that you hadn't had the shoeing of all our beasts when we forded the Wimmera." "Why, sir?" asked Ayrton. "Because out of all our horses, only the one your blacksmith had in his hands has escaped the common fate." "That's true," said John Mangles. "It's strange it happens so." "A mere chance and nothing more," replied the quartermaster, looking firmly at the Major. Major McNabbs bit his lips as if to keep back something he was about to say. Glenarvan and the rest waited for him to speak out his thoughts, but the Major was silent, and went up to the wagon, which Ayrton was examining. "What was he going to say, Mangles?" asked Glenarvan. "I don't know," replied the young captain, "but the Major is not at all a man to speak without reason." "No, John," said Lady Helena, "McNabbs must have suspicions about Ayrton." "Suspicions?" exclaimed Paganel, shrugging his shoulders. "And what can they be?" asked Glenarvan. "Does he suppose him capable of having killed our horses and bullocks? And for what purpose? Is not Ayrton's interest identical with our own?" "You are right, dear Edward," said Lady Helena. "And what is more, the quartermaster has given us incontestable proofs of his devotion ever since the commencement of the journey." "Certainly he has," replied Mangles. "But still, what could the Major mean? I wish he would speak his mind plainly out." "Does he suppose him acting in concert with the convicts?" asked Paganel imprudently. "What convicts?" said Miss Grant. "Monsieur Paganel is making a mistake," replied John Mangles instantly. "He knows very well there are no convicts in the province of Victoria." "Ah, that is true," returned Paganel, trying to get out of his unlucky speech. "Whatever had I got in my head? Convicts? Who ever heard of convicts being in Australia? Besides, they would scarcely have disembarked before they would turn into good, honest men. The climate, you know, Miss Mary, the regenerative climate." Here the poor savant stuck fast, unable to get further, like the wagon in the mud. Lady Helena looked at him in surprise, which quite deprived him of his remaining sang-froid. But seeing his embarrassment, she took Mary away to the side of the tent, where M. Albinet was laying out an elaborate breakfast. "I deserve to be transported myself," said Paganel woefully. "I think so," said Glenarvan. And after this grave reply, which completely overwhelmed the worthy geographer, Glenarvan and John Mangles went toward the wagon. They found Ayrton and the 2 sailors doing their best to get it out of the deep ruts, and the bullock and horse, yoked together, were straining every muscle. Wilson and Mulrady were pushing the wheels, and the quartermaster urging on the team with voice and goad. But the heavy vehicle did not stir. The clay, already dry, held it as firmly as if sealed by some hydraulic cement. John Mangles had the clay watered to loosen it, but it was of no use. After renewed vigorous efforts, men and animals stopped. Unless the vehicle was taken to pieces, it would be impossible to extricate it from the mud, but they had no tools for the purpose and could not attempt such a task. However, Ayrton, who was for conquering this obstacle at all costs, was about to commence afresh, when Glenarvan stopped him by saying, "Enough, Ayrton, enough. We must husband the strength of our remaining horse and bullock. If we are obliged to continue our journey on foot, the one animal can carry the ladies and the other the provisions. They may thus still be of great service to us." "Very well, my lord," replied the quartermaster, unyoking the exhausted beasts. "Now, friends," added Glenarvan, "let us return to the encampment and deliberately examine our situation, and determine on our course of action." After a tolerably good breakfast to make up for their bad night, the discussion was opened, and every one of the party was asked to give his opinion. The first point was to ascertain their exact position, and this was referred to Paganel, who informed them, with his customary rigorous accuracy, that the expedition had been stopped on the 37th parallel, in longitude 147 degrees 53 minutes, on the banks of the Snowy River. "What is the exact longitude of Twofold Bay?" asked Glenarvan. 150 degrees, replied Paganel, 2 degrees 7 minutes distant from this, and that is equal to 75 miles. "And Melbourne is?" 200 miles off at least. "Very good, our position being then settled, what is best to do?" The response was unanimous to get to the coast without delay. Lady Helena and Mary Grant undertook to go 5 miles a day. The courageous ladies did not shrink, if necessary, from walking the whole distance between the Snowy River and Twofold Bay. "You are a brave traveling companion, dear Helena," said Lord Glenarvan, "but are we sure of finding at the bay all we want when we get there?" "Without the least doubt," replied Paganel. "Eden is a municipality which already numbers many years in existence. Its port must have frequent communication with Melbourne. I suppose even at Delegate, on the Victoria frontier, 35 miles from here, we might revictual our expedition and find fresh means of transport." "And the Duncan?" asked Ayrton. "Don't you think it advisable to send for her to come to the bay?" "What do you think, John?" said Glenarvan. "I don't think your lordship should be in any hurry about it," replied the young captain, after brief reflection. "There will be time enough to give orders to Tom Austin, and summon him to the coast." "That's quite certain," added Paganel. "You see," said John, "in 4 or 5 days we shall reach Eden." 4 or 5 days, repeated Ayrton, shaking his head. "Say 15 or 20, Captain, if you don't want to repent your mistake when it is too late." 15 or 20 days to go 75 miles, cried Glenarvan. "At the least, my lord. You are going to traverse the most difficult portion of Victoria, a desert where everything is wanting, the squatters say, plains covered with scrub, where is no beaten track and no stations. You will have to walk hatchet or torch in hand, and believe me, that's not quick work." Ayrton had spoken in a firm tone, and Paganel, at whom all the others looked inquiringly, nodded his head in token of his agreement in opinion with the quartermaster. But John Mangles said, "Well, admitting these difficulties, in 15 days at most your lordship can send orders to the Duncan." "I have to add," said Ayrton, "that the principal difficulties are not the obstacles in the road, but the Snowy River has to be crossed, and most probably we must wait till the water goes down." "Wait," cried John, "is there no ford?" "I think not," replied Ayrton. "This morning I was looking for some practical crossing, but could not find any. It is unusual to meet with such a tumultuous river at this time of the year, and it is a fatality against which I am powerless." "Is this Snowy River wide?" asked Lady Helena. "Wide and deep, madam," replied Ayrton, "a mile wide with an impetuous current. A good swimmer could not go over without danger." "Let us build a boat then," said Robert, who never stuck at anything. "We have only to cut down a tree and hollow it out and get in and be off." "He's going ahead, this boy of Captain Grant S," said Paganel. "And he's right," returned John Mangles. "We shall be forced to come to that, and I think it is useless to waste our time in idle discussion." "What do you think of it, Ayrton?" asked Glenarvan seriously. "I think, my lord, that a month hence, unless some help arrives, we shall find ourselves still on the banks of the Snowy. Well then, have you any better plan to propose? Said John Mangles, somewhat impatiently. Yes, that the Duncan should leave Melbourne and go to the east coast. Oh, always the same story. And how could her presence at the bay facilitate our means of getting there? Ayrton waited an instant before answering, and then said, rather evasively, I have no wish to obtrude my opinions. What I do is for our common good, and I am ready to start the moment His Honor gives the signal. And he crossed his arms and was silent. That is no reply, Ayrton, said Glenarvan. Tell us your plan, and we will discuss it. What is it you propose? Ayrton replied in a calm tone of assurance. I propose that we should not venture beyond the Snowy in our present condition. It is here we must wait till help comes, and this help can only come from the Duncan. Let us camp here, where we have provisions, and let one of us take your orders to Tom Austin to go on to Twofold Bay. This unexpected proposition was greeted with astonishment, and by John Mangles with openly expressed opposition. Meantime, continued Ayrton, either the river will get lower and allow us to ford it, or we shall have time to make a canoe. This is the plan I submit for your lordship's approval. Well, Ayrton, replied Glenarvan, your plan is worthy of serious consideration. The worst thing about it is the delay it would cause, but it would save us great fatigue and perhaps danger. What do you think of it, friends?